All right, as we mentioned, lawmakers continuing to work on that deal to avoid fiscal disaster, but who will have the courage to take the lead on a compromise deal? Ed Lazier has been our guest host for the last hour. He is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a former chairman of President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. Joining us for the rest of the show is Don Peebles. He's chairman and CEO of the Peebles Corporation. He was a supporter of President Obama 4 years ago and just in this last election as well. And Don, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
You've heard some of the talk this morning about what needs to happen. In your vision, what would Washington do right now?
Well, I think that ultimately what we should do is have shared sacrifice, shared solution. I don't think relying on the top 2% to pay this entire bill is a realistic expectation, nor would it be helpful to the economy. So I think we have to have some balance. We've got to have some significant spending cuts. And I think that means across the board, too. Other than Social Security and Medicare, I think that we need to look at entitlements. I think the other half of the country that pays no income taxes ought to share in some way.
What does
Except
that mean?
those at the bottom.
Extending the higher, getting rid of the Bush tax cuts for everyone? Is that what
No, I think that that's probably not going to happen right now in the politics of the moment. So I think what does need to happen, though, is entitlements, not at the lowest end. Those who are suffering, who need a helping hand, we need to take care of them because we're a compassionate nation. But those who are at that middle income area, they can't afford to do with a little less. They can pay a little more in taxes, or they can give back some of these other entitlements, but there's got to be some corresponding, sacrifice. Because, for example, those who are entrepreneurs, and that's the world that I live in, that are entrepreneurs who are out here building businesses, keeping their businesses open through one of the most difficult times in our nation's history, they're looking for shared sacrifice, not that the burden all goes to them. And I think that's what Congress is going to wrestle with. And I think that's where, if the Republicans want to carve out some ground to rebuild politically, I think that's a place to start looking. And I think that our president recognizes, I know he recognizes the contributions of small businesses, and I think that there will be some support, for a shared sacrifice.
Roger Altman, who was in that chair in the last hour, suggested that you should see a balanced approach. It should be something like 1-to-1 or 1.5-to-1 when it comes to spending cuts versus revenue increases. Is that a number that you think is in the right realm?
Yeah, I think 1-to-1, or frankly, I think we should be cutting a little more than we should be increasing revenues. The reality is
1.5-to-1 if you were cutting spending, if 1.5 of that came from that.
Look, I think 1.5-to-1 would be have a resounding impact on confidence.
All right, well, let's talk about that number, Ed. Well, 1.5-to-1, yeah. Where does that get you?
I don't think that's enough. The way I think about it is somewhat different from that. Look, the average government size from 2001 to 2008 was 19.6% of GDP. Mm-hmm. We shot up to 24% of GDP in a matter of a year, and we've kind of taken that as given.
Hasn't it come back down to 22%?
Well, it's back down. Right now, it's back down to about 23.5%, and that's the long-term forecast. The question I think that we have to think about is how big should our government be? Even if you take the period 2008 during the financial crisis, we went up to 20.8%. So, that's a sustainable number, a long-term sustainable number. That was our 30-year average, by the way, was 20.8%. There's no reason why we have to take as given this very high level of expenditures by the government. What I would think we need to do is think in terms of a long-term target on the size of the government that's both realistic, understanding the demographics have changed, understanding that the economy has changed somewhat, get back down to that number, and then figure out how to finance it.
Well, the other part is that revenue over that time period has been about 18% of GDP.
18.3% is right.
18.3% to GDP.
That's right.
20.8% in spending.
Right.
The growth that we've seen traditionally has taken care of that. If we're looking at lower growth numbers, though, those numbers have to be squeezed too.
That's right. And so historically, our deficit has been, as you just pointed out, 2.5%. And you think, wow, that's not great. Well, it's not great, but it pales by comparison with the current 9% deficit that we've had over the past 3 years. So we can't be in a situation where we are spending at the level that we're spending now. We've got to figure out a way to get back to where we were, at least in terms of long-term path toward a more responsible spending pattern. So I think we can do it. I don't think that adopting a sort of a 1-for-1 or a 1.5-for-1 is the right way to think about it. It's just not the right way to think about it. What we ought to be doing is thinking about what should the size of government be, and what do we need to do to finance
Although it
that.
is the way that Washington's thinking about it.
I know that. But
Every
again,
deal that's been laid out has been on how much is your spending cuts, how much is your revenue.
Right, but I'm not going to concede to the politics of it. I think the logic is what we should be focusing on. We should look at the evidence on what's worked in the past, what's worked for other countries, and what is the appropriate thing to do, not what's politically feasible, what's politically sound. I mean, I understand those things always matter, but you got to start from what's right and then let the politics play out.
Don, do you get frustrated? And here's what frustrates me with all of the things that are happening. It's the single-minded focus on the 250 and above going back to 39.6. That's what frustrates me, is that raises $80 billion a year. You know, we've got $1 trillion deficit. It's $800 billion over 10 years. It's important, but then I think of all the other things that a business owner would like to see accomplished in this second term, in terms of entitlement reform or pro-growth policies, or so many things to think about, and yet so little emphasis on anything but that, just that speech, again and again and again. As a business owner, when you watch that, do you just finally say, enough with isn't there anything else in your universe that makes sense to talk about other than letting it expire on the high end?
Well, I think that this idea of focusing on the 250,000 and above, which is not the high end in New York City, for example.
No, I know.
In San Francisco, in Los Angeles,
that's all we
in
talk
Washington,
about.
DC.
Think of all the things that we could be talking about long term to get back to 4% growth.
Well, it's a symbol. It's become a symbol, unfortunately.
We need symbols. We need answers here.
I agree, but I think that what it's become is a symbol and a symbolic gesture that those who are making more should pay more.
And then
it's been a distraction. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. In fact, if we, as you just pointed out, if we let them expire on everybody at 250 or more, it still wouldn't make a difference.
And it could be negative.
And it would be a negative impact.
Well, I think it
would be. I think that is one of the points that has gotten lost a little bit, is how small and medium-sized business owners pay taxes.
Right.
I pay taxes at the individual level, because all of our businesses are either limited liability companies, limited partnerships, or
they'll say it's only 2%. They'll say it's only 2% of the small business. Jobs, but it's 52% of the revenue, and it's a big part of the employees.
It's going to be somewhere and if we're going to get out of this slow growth pattern that we're in right now, we're going to have to rely upon small businesses to create the jobs, and they're going to create about 80 to 90%, depending on who you're talking to, of the new jobs.
I mean, you disagree with most of this stuff. I know you.
I disagree with the issue in terms of focusing on increasing taxes. I think that is a wrong message to send, because in an economy.
But then why would you be for closing deductions, which, by the way, has the same effect? If you're talking about trying to grow the economy, if that's the argument.
Not necessarily on small businesses. It doesn't have the same.
No, well, actually, no.
In some respects, it may.
Well, go ahead. I'll let you finish your point. No, addressing deductions is basically deductions are another form of entitlements. It's more of a way to support, pet causes for lawmakers. But they have minimal impact when revenue starts growing and businesses start growing. And we need businesses to have more of their money to reinvest it, pay employees, reinvest in infrastructure.
I would think that the president could be better served saying, you know what, this corporate tax rate is too high. There's $2 trillion abroad that's left over there.
But you hear him saying that.
No, wait, don't I hear him? Not really.
Well, he has said that.
He has said it, but it's not the overarching. Right. He didn't say I ran on that. He says I ran on raising taxes on the rich. I got a mandate to raise taxes on the rich.
He ran on reducing income taxes on those people who make $250,000 or less.
But that's not.
That's what he. Right. That's his message. Not raising taxes, but reducing taxes.
But that's not a pro-growth policy.
Well,
it's not
something
that gets us where we want to go.
You know what? I think part of the issue also is that we keep lumping all of these into one. Reducing taxes for 95% of the country is a good thing.
Keeping them where they are.
Right. And that's a good thing. It's what are we going to do with the other 5%? And then what are we going to do about cutting spending? And also, no one's talking about 63% of the budget. Everybody's talking about this other amount. No one's talking about some real hardcore cuts.
Don, in the speech tomorrow, how much is going to be an emphasis on lowering corporate tax rates, and how much of the emphasis is going to be on cutting spending versus I got a pen here. The Senate has a bill that extends them for all the folks.
Although you've got posturing right now. In the
well, I know, but we've had posturing for 2 years on this.
Well, we've had posturing for decades. Congress, the House of Representatives is the most political body in the country. It is very political. They run every 2 years. They get 1 year to try to get anything done, and then they're in perpetual re-election mode every other year. So the reality is that you've got a lot of politics and a lot of political theater.
From the president, Don. It's not going to come from the House. It needs to come from
the
president.
you got a Congress, but you got a divided Congress.
39-6 is not. That's not the leader. That's not going to get us where we need to go.
I think we'll see the president compromise.
All right, we'll see tomorrow how much he talks about territoriality and $2 trillion overseas and 28% corporate tax rate. I doubt if that's going to be the core of what he talks about.
I would like to see, and I believe that we'll start seeing a gradual transition from the activist candidate, President Obama, to the leader and commander-in-chief, President Obama, who's more of a person who's going to get things done.
Saying that for 5 years. Well, 4 and a half.
No,
3 and a half. All right, and when's it coming?
It's slowly coming. Change slowly comes.
All right, we will continue. Our guest hosts, again, Ed Lazier and Don Peebles, will have more of them throughout the hour.
Welcome back to Squawk. I was going to say a beautiful shot, but sort of a gray-looking shot of Washington, D.C. Right there. We're just seconds away from durable goods data for October. We got Steve Leisman here saying that they're going to be, what do you say, awful?
They're going to be awful.
Going to be awful?
Yeah, there's a lot working against it. Just bad CapEx.
Real numbers are.
Boeing, and then you have a piece of Sandy in there.
Okay, let's get to Rick Santelli, who's standing by at the CME in Chicago. Rick, the numbers.
Not as awful as one would suspect. We are unchanged, which is a lot less awful than the expectations of down 0.75%. Last month, which was unbelievably strong at 9.9, remains pretty darn strong at 9.2. Subtle revision. Let's do the takeouts. Let's take out transportation. We're left with up 1.5. That's really good because we see that aircraft worked in favor of this subtraction. Now let's look at the orders. Non-defense, ex-aircraft. This is that business expenditure for capital goods that we all pay attention to, and there was definite improvement. 1.7, that's over 2% better on an absolute value basis than we were looking for. One fly in the ointment, if you take our last look, which was unchanged, what didn't make us happy for September, now it's down 0.4. Now, if we look at shipments versus orders, that is down, but much less than expected, it down 0.4. So to summarize, if this month is give back to last month, it could be a lot worse. Absolutely zero change in pre-opening equities, which are unchanged. The S&P may be up a little bit. The dollar index unchanged. Interest rates may be up a basis point. That's really about it. We're a little bit gray here. You said we're gray in Washington. I can believe that. Back to you.
Okay, Rick, don't go anywhere. Stay where you are. We're going to get more on this data. Steve Leisman, you just said this was surprising.
So having eaten considerable amounts of turkey last Thursday, let me now eat crow. Exactly. I'm shocked by these numbers. I did not read a single positive outlook on this number. There were so many things working against it, beginning with the general downtrend in capital spending that we've had. And I think Rick mentioned this, but the CapEx number inside of here, non-defense aircraft plus 1.7%. First month of the quarter has been generally a negative quarter. We had a little bit of Sandy in this number, some factory shutdowns. I think that might have showed up a bit in the shipments. Boeing numbers were supposed to be down relative to the prior month, and they were a little bit, but you still managed to do unchanged. So where's the strength? Some communication strength, some general machinery strength. Look, the number is so volatile, but what we have been noticing was this tremendous dissonance between what's happening with the consumer and what's happening on the business side. This is a 1 month snapback. One thing that some economists have pointed out is you very rarely have CapEx being slashed without employment being slashed. We haven't seen the employment being slashed, so maybe there is some hope for CapEx.
But we haven't seen the hiring, and maybe that's...
Well, we have seen the hiring in the sense that we've been doing, 150, 160.
Nope.
What do you mean, no?
No. JOLTS is the same. Hiring's the same. 4.2 million per month, 4.2 million per month,
But
January
we're adding
09.
150, 160 a month.
150, 160 per month is just barely above treading water. Why? Remember, population went up by 10 million since 2009. We should have had about 5.5 million jobs. We've had
Right.
less than that.
Right.
Our employment to population ratio has fallen by 2 percentage points. We used to have 61% of the country working. We have 59% of the country working. We're not turning around. Things are flat. This number, to me, is indicative of what's happening. We're flat. We're basically just moving along, treading water, muddling along. And so, to me, it's not a surprise. I mean, I don't, I guess.
I don't
Steve,
agree, Ed. I don't agree with your characterization of it. I don't disagree with the numbers. I think we're doing a little bit better than flat. I think we're adding it. We did enough growth. If we do, in fact, mark up on Thursday from 2 to 2.8%, there was, in fact, enough growth in the economy to bring down the unemployment rate by a couple tenths. So that was not really the outlier that perhaps it was portrayed at the time. We're adding 150, 160. Yes, we have had a decline in the participation rate. Most of the studies I've seen suggest that maybe about half of that is because of demographics, the aging of the population, and maybe the other half is people who are discouraged and walking away from the workforce. So my point is it's not gangbusters, but it's also not flat. It's mediocre to a little bit better than that.
Well, I think,
it's maybe a semantic argument.
Well, it may be, but when I say flat, if you have a growth rate that deviates from the long-term trend, so we're at 2% growth right now for the past 3 years. Long-term trend is 3% growth. So not only are we not recovering, but what we're doing is we're moving further and further away from the long-term trajectory. So to me, that's flat at
Look,
best.
you're the expert on this, Ed, which means that I am more than happy to argue with you. But the 3% long-term trend, according to Ben Bernanke, may be too high, right? And so the issue...
So make it 2.6.
No, it's not an idle issue, Ed. The issue of what is trend is key to policy.
Right.
What policy are we shooting for? What's interesting about both political parties, and has been for a long time, is both parties are shooting for a 3% growth rate, but they just differ on how to get there, right?
Sure. Yeah.
The question is 3% the number to shoot for? Should we be happy or be content with a 2.5% underlying growth rate, or even something closer to 2.25%, which was really what I thought was the suggestion inside of Bernanke's speech last week, was that maybe trend is quite a bit lower, which means, by the way, yuck is absolutely the right term in terms of the...
Good for you, Becky.
Well, yuck...
I mean, there's no reason why we have to be satisfied with 2% growth or 2.2% growth or even 3% growth. There's nothing in the formula that says you couldn't have 4% growth for a sustained period of time.
Well, what's a sustained period of time?
Well,
2 decades? I mean, 2 decades. You could certainly have that. That's possible.
Can we just tell people, Ed, what the components are so they understand?
Sure.
What's really interesting is potential growth is something that's really easy to figure out. It's productivity plus growth in hours worked. Just those two components will give you the growth of the economy. Okay, now tell me what productivity is going to be and what growth hours worked is going to be, which has to do with the population, the growth in the workforce, how trained the workforce is. So, Ed, I would submit that some of what you say is absolutely within our control.
Right.
Other parts are sort of inexorable.
But what about Moore's Law? Doesn't that make productivity constantly
increase?
It
does. But let's say you have an increasingly uneducated workforce.
Then we've got problems.
But then they work against each other, right? You take more and more people and put them to work with fewer and fewer skills, right? So this gets into it. Again, it's all about policy. What is the policy of the government?
You said it right, Steve. So,
Thank you.
So what we need to focus on is we're not going to have population growth as the solution to this. That doesn't help per capita income. What you need is technological change
and training,
human capital,
and human capital training.
Absolutely. Okay. So when we think about this, if I turn to Don and I say, all right, what is it that's going to create productivity growth? You think about it from a business point of view. What creates productivity growth? What makes factories more productive? What makes services more productive? So what kinds of things would you be thinking about there if that were the key question? Because that is the key question for the long term.
Well, one of the things is, of course, we need more demand. But I think we need one of the challenges we're having in some of the markets we operate in, say especially South Florida, is finding skilled workforce.
Okay, stop right there, because that's a key issue. And my question has been, whose responsibility is it to provide skilled workers to business? I just saw a story the other day where a company got so frustrated in lack of skilled workers that it decided to train workers. And I thought, you know what? Why have we been waiting for this for so long? Why aren't more companies out there training and getting the skilled workers that they need.
Don't work.
The economics and also the time.
economics of not having the skilled workers also doesn't work for you.
Law firms are rising up. There was a story in the New York Times maybe 6-8 months ago about how law firms are frustrated that law schools don't do anything to actually teach lawyers how to be lawyers. It's all about theory and thinking and all of these things, and then they have to train the lawyers when they get there. No, but I mean, there's a real argument. Is our education set up properly?
So are you guys? Is this a government responsibility? Is it a business responsibility? Because we just established how key it is to our growth rate.
But we just talked. We know that we are responsible for educating our children. The question is, are we educating them in the right skills and in the right training setup? So I mean, we know that
everything in life.
It's the most effective way to educate our children.
We are going to thank Steve.
We haven't solved the problem, man.
Well,
how do you move on? There's still so much more to discuss.
What do you want to do?
Well, I want to solve this education.
We could do a.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to point out there's still more to talk about.
There is. Rick, we appreciate it, as do Steve. Thank you for coming on.
All right, let's get back to our guest hosts, Ed Lazier and Don Peebles. They've got the last word. Gentlemen, we brought this idea together to figure we'd have representatives of both sides of the aisle come together and figure out if they could reach an agreement. Could the two of you sit down and actually hammer something out?
Absolutely. I think we're both reasonable people. We're both looking at the big picture, and we're looking at the consequences, and we're not activists.
All right, you have 3 minutes. Ready? Go. Give a deal together that the two of you could live with.
I agree with Ed in terms of we have to fundamentally determine how much, as a government, we want to spend, and what the government's going to do, what role our government's going to have, and how big a role.
Couldn't both you guys sign on to Simpson-Bowles?
Simpson-Bowles is a step in the right direction. My problem with Simpson-Bowles is that it still doesn't focus on high growth for the long run. We really need to get back to. We need to get back to that.
I mean, you think we should do 3 to 1 spending versus tax increases?
Well, I gave you my answer earlier in response to Becky. I think we should have a target for the size of government, and we should get there by funding it in the most efficient way possible.
You think it should be 1 to 1 or 3 to 1?
Well, I think that in the political theater that we're dealing with, in the political reality we're dealing with, I think it should be 1.5 to 1 on spending. Because if we're going to look at those numbers, I think that's the wrong way to approach it. I think Ed's right that we should look at, just like I'd look at our business. What does our business want to do? What services are we going to provide? And how much of our revenues are we going to spend to provide those services?
You'd be off the reservation if you didn't say 1.5 to 1. I'll bet you're more 3 to 1. In fact, wouldn't you just like to shrink?
By the way, as a minimum.
I can't believe we're even talking about 1 to 1 and 1.5 to 1.
I can't either. I mean, if we're 25% of GDP being spent on government, we know we need to shrink that. And we can't just shrink the growth of it. We need to shrink it.
We certainly have to come out of this
in a so-called fair way. I guess you need to say there has to be the pain has to be shared. But the overriding thing we need to do is shrink the size of government. Override it.
Agreed.
Okay.
But the House of Representatives is the wrong place to accomplish that, unfortunately.
What's the right place?
Well, I think collectively, but I think that the Senate, if the Senate had gone the other way a little bit, well, you know, I think the House of Representatives is going to be too much of a reactionary body. So
I think the president should lead us, and he should lead us in 3 directions. 1 is fundamental tax reform. 2 is trade, and really aggressive trade agenda. We're less than 5% of the world's population. We've got to start moving to looking to our neighbors to the south and to the Pacific. And the third thing is a much more sensible policy on regulation, which means cost-benefit analysis.
You wouldn't disagree with any of that?
No, I don't disagree with that. I think you should add more, though. I think the president's got to come up with a more comprehensive plan for growing small businesses, for job generation. There's no other way to create jobs. I looked at the New York City's employment numbers for last month. Do you know that the private sector job growth declined? There was a loss of about maybe 3,000 or 4,000 jobs in the private sector. It was the public sector. The New York City government actually grew and added employees. That's the wrong way. We got to have the private sector growing, the government reducing the number of employees.
Gentlemen, thank you both for being here today. It's been a pleasure. Ed, Don, we'll have you both back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.